Scarlet and Violet added 30 new abilities to the game. My name is Wolfey, I'm a competitive player, and I'm here to tell you which of these new abilities are worth your time and which of them you should skip on. First, we have Anger Shell. This is Cloth's signature ability. This ability activates when the user's HP drops to 1/2 or less. And what it does is it lowers both defense stats by 1 stage and boosts the attack, special attack, and speed stats of the Pokemon in question. This is basically like the move Shell Smash, but a little toned down. This, in my opinion, is a phenomenal ability. Once your HP drops below half, you're probably not planning on living that much longer anyway. On the other hand, being able to suddenly boost your offensive stats can totally swing a fight. Cloth isn't the best Pokemon, which is a topic for a different video, so I don't expect this ability to see a ton of play, but if this ability were on a really good Pokemon, it would absolutely be great. Next up, we have Armor Tail, which is the signature ability of Farigiraf. While this is technically a new ability, it basically functions the exact same as Dazzling, which is Brux's signature ability, and Queenly Majesty, which is Serena's. It stops the opponent from using priority attacks. This is a very good ability, and we've even seen Serena get some play thanks to it. This isn't the kind of ability that's just gonna overwhelm the opponent, and it isn't that flashy, so most players might overlook it, but what it does provide is really nice to have and can help you out of a lot of tight spots. The rest of this list is going to be alphabetical, but I'm grouping the next 4 together because they all basically do the same thing. These abilities are the Beads of Ruin, Sword of Ruin, Tablets of Ruin, and Vessel of Ruin. What they do is lower the special defense, special attack, defense, and attack of all Pokemon in play except for the holder. I don't want to talk too much about the Pokemon that hold these abilities because I imagine that a lot of you probably haven't encountered them yet. But what I will say is that each of these abilities is very, very strong. A Pokemon's stats are a major part of what makes it good, and being able to lower all stats except your own is a pretty big deal. Of course, this does affect your partner, but if you really think about it, you're negatively impacting 2 of your opponent's Pokemon and only 1 of your own, so that's a positive trade in my books. Next up, we have the ability Commander. This is the signature ability of the Pokemon Tatsugiri, and it only activates when an ally Dondozo is on the field. Tatsugiri enters Dondozo's mouth, and it causes all of Dondozo's stats to be raised by 2 stages. Being able to give a Pokemon a +2 boost in every stat is ridiculous. But the drawback of it only working when you have both Pokemon on the field together at the same time is pretty steep. In all other scenarios, both Pokemon will be playing without an ability. Of all the abilities I'm going to talk about on this list, this is the one that I am the most unsure of, and though I think it has a lot of potential, it's really hard to say without extensive testing. What I will say is that this is one of the abilities that I am the most excited to try out. And if nothing else, I think it's a really fun and clever gimmick. Yet another signature ability is next. This one is named Co-Star. It's unique to Flamigo. When the Pokemon switches in, it will copy all of its allies' stat changes. Imagine you use close combat a couple times and your defenses were lowered a ton. Or maybe your opponent's been lowering your Pokemon stats for a while and poor Flamigo is stuck holding the bag. On the other end though, you can do something very interesting. The most obvious example to me comes from Belly Drum, where a Pokemon sacrifices half of its maximum HP in exchange for maxing out its attack stat. Flamigo can switch in after Belly Drum is set up and get all of the benefits with none of the cost. Dragon Dance and Swords Dance are also really good ways of boosting your stats without major drawbacks. And with the addition of the new item, the Clear Amulet, which I discussed in this video, it's much harder to lower physical attacker stats. I would not be surprised at all to see Flamigo winning tournaments with this amazing ability. Next up, we have Cudchew. This ability states that if a Pokemon eats a berry, it will then consume that same berry at the end of the next turn. Most of the time, this is going to be used with an HP restoring berry like Citrus Berry to just get a little bit of extra health. There are some other ways you can use this, like with stat boosting berries, but the thing is that for most of these berries, they only activate when your HP falls very low. So the value you get from eating the same berry twice is not as much because you're just not likely to stick around for very long. I don't think it's a bad ability by any means. And I think that Farigiraf is going to be grateful to have it because you can always just chuck a Citrus Berry on it and have it be better. But I don't know. I don't think it's that high of a ceiling. Next up, we have one of the most broken abilities on this list that you're probably not going to see very much because it was given to a Pokemon that just isn't that great. I'm talking about Earth Eater, which is the signature ability of Earthworm. To make it simple, if you're familiar with Water Absorb, it's just that, but for ground type attacks. Ground is one of the single best offensive types in the game, and so becoming immune to them already is a pretty big deal. It's part of the reason why Pokemon with Levitate are really good. So to have an ability that not only makes you immune, but also heals you up 25% every time you're even touched by a ground type attack is a pretty big deal. This is further emphasized in double battles, where Earthquake, one of the most common ground type attacks, can be used to not only damage your partner, but also heal your ally. Without this ability, I don't imagine Earthworm gets that much play. But because of its strength and the fact that it gets access to the attack Shed Tail, which is very, very powerful, I could actually see Earthworm getting some use. It's never going to be the best Pokemon in the metagame because it just doesn't have the stats for it, but I wouldn't be surprised to see it on a couple niche teams. I definitely thought that we'd have a non-signature ability at this point in the video, but we don't. The next one is Electromorphosis, which is Bellybolt's signature ability. It states that whenever the user is hit by a damaging attack, their next electric move becomes charged, doing even more damage. In most cases, you're going to end up being charged before you attack, especially because Bellybolt is so slow. You could activate it with your partner, but most of the time, I'm going to guess that it's not going to be necessary. This is kind of just a most of the time damage buff on one of your Pokemon's electric type attacks, so I think it's pretty good, especially with how strong electric is as an offensive type. Okay, next we get to the ability that makes me go good as gold is the signature evolution of Gimmighoul's evolution. It protects the user from all other Pokemon's status moves. This includes not only moves like Will-O-Wisp and Spore and Thunderwave and Sleep Powder, but also moves like Taunt and Encore. This ability is phenomenal on its own, but it's also on a Steel and Ghost type, which is incredible defensive typing, pairing the type with the most resistances with the one with the most immunities, and the Pokemon also has really good stats. Status moves are especially effective against Pokemon that are hard to get off the field. So good as gold making you completely immune to them is, yeah, as the name states, good. I just want to take a second and ask you to subscribe. For Scarlet and Violet, I have quadrupled the amount of videos that I'm putting out, so subscribing now is like the best bang for your buck. I'm really trying to be the first competitive Pokemon channel to reach 1 million subscribers, and I kind of need your help to do it. Regardless, I really appreciate you watching, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the video. After that really strong ability, we get something a bit more reasonable. This is Guard Dog, and it's exclusive to Mobostiff. It does two things. First, it boosts the Pokemon's attack stat if it would be intimidated. And second, it prevents the Pokemon from forcibly being switched out. Think Roar, Whirlwind. Having yourself get powered up via Intimidate is always a good thing, given Intimidate is one of the most common abilities in the format. And the truth is that the immunity to Roar and Whirlwind and such really isn't that big a deal. These moves don't come into play very often. In my opinion, this is kind of the equivalent of having the ability Defiant, but a little bit worse. But Defiant is a good ability, so it's not that bad. Okay, if the last ability was a little underwhelming, this is the reverse. This is Hadron Engine. It is the signature ability of Miraidon, and it is either the single best new ability introduced or the second best. What it does is it turns the ground to electric terrain when the Pokemon enters the battle. Does it sound like Tapu Koko's ability, Electric Surge? Well, you're right. Both of these abilities do the same thing. Except they don't. Now, while Tapu Koko managed to win Worlds twice in the 4 years that it was legal, in large part because its ability is so good, Miraidon has even more going for it. Miraidon gets a special attack boost whenever electric terrain is on the field. I cannot overstate how powerful this ability is. Honestly, genuinely, I am really dreading when these Pokemon become tournament legal. While I'm sure that counterplay will be developed, the sheer power that this ability grants is bonkers. And to be honest, I wouldn't be surprised if we saw Miraidon even surpassing the power level of Zacian and Calyrex Shadow. To be clear, it's too early to know for sure, but we have a lot of reason to be worried. Okay, we finally have a more reasonable ability. This is Lingering Aroma, and though it's a unique ability to Oinkologne, it's basically just a rename of the Mummy ability from one of my favorite Pokemon, Cofagrigus. Basically, if you make contact with a Pokemon with Lingering Aroma, your ability then gets replaced with Lingering Aroma. If it happened whenever the Pokemon took damage, that would be one thing, but it only works on moves that make direct contact with the user. It is nice to overwrite your opponent's abilities, but if you aren't careful, you can overwrite their ability with Lingering Aroma, and then if your partner attacks that Pokemon, then your partner can lose their ability too. So it's just a little bit volatile, I would say, especially because there's no guarantee that it will even activate in the first place. Also, a lot of Pokemon who use contact moves have abilities that activate when they switch in and are kind of useless after that point. So it's a fun ability, albeit not the best one. Next up, we have the ability Mycelium Might, which is unique to Toedscool and Toedscruel. This ability has somewhat of a reverse prankster effect where if a Pokemon uses a status move, it will have lower priority compared to other moves. In exchange, these status moves will ignore the target's ability. So if Toedscruel uses Spore on a Pokemon with Insomnia, they can still be put to sleep. To me, it seems like a lot of the new abilities they introduced this generation have a lot of potential. Maybe they're not going to be the strongest abilities, but they at least make you think about how you could use them. This is the first ability where I honestly think it's kind of bad. There aren't that many abilities that explicitly protect from status conditions, and since this is unique to Toedscruel, who's a relatively fast Pokemon who has access to the amazing move Spore, Having an ability that causes you to use Spore after your opponents have already attacked is, I don't know, I don't think it's that good. I'd be happy to be proven wrong, but I almost think this is kind of like a Truant slaking situation where they were worried it was going to be too powerful, so they gave it an ability that holds it back. Next up, we have Opportunist. This one I am personally familiar with because it gave me some trouble during my playthrough. It's the signature ability of Espathra, and it allows the user to copy any opposing stat boosts when they occur. This is not like Flamigo's Co-Star, where when the Pokemon switches in, it will copy boosts. It's instead like a situation where, let's say an opponent uses Calm Mind in front of Espathra. Espathra will also get those boosts. Being able to steal your opponent's boost can come in handy, though I will say that it feels like, at least in competitive Pokemon, a lot of the more common boosting moves are physical rather than special. I think that this ability is most effective when you're catching your opponent off guard. Let's say they have a Volcarona, they're trying to use Quiver Dance, and you can switch in your Espathra and copy the boost and then try and sweep them first. These scenarios feel kind of few and far between, so while this ability is totally good, I think its limited distribution really hurts it, especially because you probably won't be able to catch your opponent off guard and they can just choose not to boost if they're worried about you stealing it. Next up, we have one of the two most broken abilities on this entire list, Orichalcum Pulse. This ability turns the sunlight harsh when the Pokemon enters the battle. It also boosts the Pokemon's attack stat when it enters the battle. Sort of like every year I tell myself, Pokemon's gonna learn this time. They're gonna learn this time. They're gonna learn this time. It just keeps getting worse. They did nerf Zacian going into this generation, but it doesn't help us if Koraidon and Miraidon are just as broken. Keep in mind that Groudon, who in many ways is a little underpowered compared to more recent legendary Pokemon, still was one of the best legendary Pokemon the last time it was legal, in large part because of drought. So to have a new ability that not only sets the sun up, but also gives your Pokemon an attack boost whenever the sun is active, whether you set it up or not, is of the abilities on this list, this is either number 1 or number 2, depending on how you rank it against Miraidon's ability, which is very similar. Next up, we have Photosynthesis. This ability is found on the Paradox Pokemon unique to Pokemon Scarlet. It boosts their highest stat when harsh sunlight is active or if they're holding the booster energy item. Being able to boost your highest stat is pretty good, as we have learned from Sword and Shield. While not quite as broken as Koraidon and Miraidon's signature abilities, this is still a very good, very versatile ability. It's nice that you have multiple ways of activating it, both with the harsh sunlight, or if you don't have access to that on your team, you can also use the booster energy. It's also versatile because, of course, it boosts whatever your highest stat is, so different builds of the same Pokemon can boost different stats. This is absolutely one of the strongest abilities on our list, and I'm sure that it will only become stronger as players better learn to optimize for it. Next up, we have the signature ability of one of my favorite new Pokemon, Purifying Salt. This ability protects the user from status conditions, not status moves, and halves the damage taken from ghost type attacks. Being immune to status conditions is really nice, especially on a physical attacker. Rock types aren't really known for their positive type matchups defensively, so getting an additional resistance to ghost is also nice as well. I feel like this ability landed in a really good place, where it's not broken by any means, but it's good, and it will contribute to battles and allow the Pokemon that uses it to be more viable. I feel like this ability really nailed the appropriate level of power, and I would love to see more abilities that are similarly powerful in the future. Spark Drive is the violent equivalent of Photosynthesis. It activates when electric terrain is up, or if the Pokemon is holding the booster energy. I would argue that this is ever so slightly worse than Photosynthesis, reason being that it's harder to set up electric terrain than it is to set up the harsh sunlight. That being said, it's obviously still extraordinarily good, and everything that I said for Photosynthesis also applies here. Rocky Payload, the signature ability of Bombardier. This ability is simple. It powers up the damage that rock type attacks do. It's a damage boost on your rock type moves, but it's not that valuable at the end of the day. Bombardier is nothing special when it comes to a Pokemon anyway, and though it is nice to get a damage boost on rock type attacks, it's not saving the fact that this Pokemon just isn't that good. This ability basically makes Bombardier better than it would be, but it doesn't make it good. Seed Sower is Arboliva's signature ability. It's similar to Grassy Surge in that it sets up grassy terrain, but the difference is that it activates when the Pokemon takes damage. One of the benefits of Grassy Surge is that when the Pokemon switches in, it always sets up grassy terrain. There's no additional condition that needs to be met. So let's say you're worried about taking damage from Earthquake, you can switch in your Rillaboom and know that regardless of what else happens, you will get the grassy terrain up. On the other hand, if your opponent resets the terrain while your Rillaboom is on the field, you won't have another way of getting it back up until you leave the field and re-enter. The advantage of something like Seed Sower is that you can theoretically set Grassy Terrain up multiple times if it gets overwritten without needing to switch out. And the drawback to that, of course, is that you might not get Grassy Terrain up as soon as you want. The jury's still out on whether Seed Sower or Grassy Terrain are better abilities, but between you and me, I wouldn't be shocked if Seed Sower was at least as good, if not better, than Grassy Surge. Okay, we finally have our first new ability that actually affects multiple returning Pokemon. Sharpness is a new ability that is only given to 4 Pokemon, but it's really cool. It adds a new subcategory of move, Slicing Move, and powers them up by 50%. This is moves like Stone Edge, X Scissor, Psycho Cut, Air Slash. Being able to boost some of your moves by 50% is really nice. And the fact that it's not limited to one type, like Rocky Payload was, just makes it more versatile. The Pokemon that receive this ability, like, to be honest, just aren't that great, but it does improve their viability a lot. I think this is an above average strength ability that's given to below average strength Pokemon, making it average. Okay, this next one's really cool. Supreme Overlord is the unique ability of Kingambit, the evolution of Bisharp. It boosts the Pokemon's attack and special attack stats a little bit for each Pokemon that has already fainted in the user's party. Now, at the time I'm recording this, the only information I can find about this online is that it boosts it slightly for each fainted ally. So I don't know exactly how much this is, but even if it's something as little as 10%, on a Pokemon with good stats like Gambit, this can end up adding up quite a bit. I think this is a really cool ability that has a really high ceiling, but you also might end up just having it be completely worthless if Kingambit is the first Pokemon to go down. I honestly really like that Pokemon is experimenting a little more with this kind of fainted Pokemon mechanic. Between this ability and Houndstone's new attack, Last Respects, I think it's a really interesting concept about balancing how strong your remaining Pokemon get by sacrificing your current ones. Assuming that it's balanced properly, which is a big assumption. Thermal Exchange, the signature ability of the Baxcalibur line. This boosts the Pokemon's attack stat when hit by a fire type move and prevents the user from being burnt. I feel similarly about this ability to how I feel about Purifying Salt, which is that it seems like it's really well balanced. It doesn't make the holder immune to fire type attacks, but it does provide them value if it's hit by them, and you get that nice immunity to burn, which is always good on physical attackers. It isn't single-handedly going to shoot the Pokemon's viability up by several tiers, but it is a nice little benefit to have. But something I do think is really neat about this ability is the kind of risk reward your opponent has when they're using attacks like Heat Wave and Eruption that hit both of your Pokemon. In a situation like this, your opponent might have to choose between getting fire damage on the partner and giving Baxcalibur an attack boost. Again, this is kind of a niche scenario, but I do think it's interesting and overall, to me, seems relatively well balanced. Next up, we have Toxic Debris. This is the signature ability of the Glamora line, and I think it's really cool. Basically, in competitive Pokemon, entry hazards are not really a thing because you're only bringing 4 Pokemon to each match, and you just don't have that much time to set up entry hazards. Having an ability that sets up passively is really nice, as it can break Focus Sashes and just generally do some nice passive damage. Of course, Glamora being a rock type is a little scary because it has a lot of weaknesses, but it feels like there's always a good number of not so powerful physical attacks in the metagame like Fake Out and Rock Slide. I think this ability is good, but it's not broken by any means. If you activate it once your opponent is already down to their last couple Pokemon, it basically has no value. And of course, there's always the possibility that you take too much damage, that setting up your Toxic Spikes really aren't that worth it. Or that your opponent is a poison type in the back, or that their Pokemon are just straight up immune to Toxic Spikes in the first place. That being said, there's also a number of scenarios where having Toxic Spikes up is really good. So I expect this to be an ability that has really high highs and maybe some low lows as well. Next up, we have the Well-Baked Body. This ability is kind of nutty. It makes you not only immune to fire type attacks, but if you ever get hit by a fire type attack, your defense is boosted by 2 stages. It's only balanced because it was given to a Pokemon that isn't that good at the end of the day. If this ability were like somewhat common, we would have a major problem on our hands. I think that this ability has unique synergy with Terra Steel. Because Darkspawn is a pure fairy type, it's weak to poison and steel. Terra Steel is normally a good option on fairy types because steel resists both poison and steel, but it has additional use on Darkspawn because Darkspawn is immune to fire types, which check steel types. Having an immunity to a type in general is really nice, and this is one of the only ways to get an immunity to fire apart from Flash Fire, so I think it's really cool. Okay, next up we have Wind Power. This is one of the worst abilities on our list. It only activates when a Pokemon is hit by a wind type move, which are not that common in general. What it does is it applies a charge to the user's next electric type attack. Basically the same thing as Bellibolt, except instead of activating whenever the Pokemon takes damage, it activates when it's specifically hit by a wind move. This is a tough activation condition in the first place, and the reward being somewhat mediocre just makes it not a good ability, especially when you compare it to our next ability, which is kind of the same thing except way better. Wind Rider is another new ability that also interacts with wind type moves. However, rather than a kind of measly power up, it not only makes the user immune, it also boosts their attack stat. Not only that, it will also boost the user's attack stat if Tailwind, one of the best supporting moves in the game, goes into effect. And that's if either you or your opponent uses it. So if your partner uses Tailwind, Brambleghast, the only user of this ability, not only doubles its speed, but gets an attack boost to boot. I think this is a way better execution of this whole wind move concept in the first place, especially because Brambleghast is actually weak to a lot of these wind moves, unlike Kilowattrel, who's the one who uses wind power. Last, but certainly not least, we have Zero to Hero. This is the unique ability of Palafin, and it's weird. I guess the closest comparison is actually Ash Greninja, where the Pokemon will transform, but only under certain conditions. The thing is, while Ash Greninja had to take a KO to activate, which was to a certain extent preventable by your opponent, this is in stark contrast to Zero to Hero, whose activation condition is simply that Palafin switches out. Now, this is much easier to attain, and the rewards are definitely worth it. Palafin gains an absolutely ridiculous amount of stats, going from a pretty mediocre Pokemon to a very powerful one. As a side note, I think this is a really funny lore thing because it's like, it refuses to let anyone see it transform because it's like a hero and it has to go like, no one can know its secret identity, but I digress. I think this is a really interesting concept because while Palafin once transformed has incredible stats, having to switch out is kind of a big deal. First of all, you're going to want to lead with your Palafin most of the time, because you want to transform as soon as possible. And that telegraphs to your opponent that you're going to be switching out. With that knowledge, they know that they're not under as much offensive pressure, and they can use that to either set up or try to do a ton of damage. That being said, once transformed, this Pokemon is broken. So I'm really interested to see how players maneuver Palafin to get this extreme power without having to pay a really hefty price. And that's what I think about every new ability in Scarlet and Violet. Let me know which of them is your favorite, and if there's any I oversold or maybe underestimated. Thanks for watching.